welcome everybody. Welcome Dorothy. Thank you for being here on this sunny Geneva day, okay, virtually. A couple of quick points before we get started. If everyone can mute your Zoom, that would be great. It will help with keeping down some of the noise. I apologize in advance that you may hear music in the background. It's a band rehearsing for tomorrow's commencement for the class of 2020, which is outside the window here in Cox Hall tomorrow. Secondly, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, which is at the bottom of the screen if you're not already familiar with Zoom. So with that, let's get started. I am delighted to welcome Dorothy. Let me give you a little bit of a background for those of you who don't know her. She's the author of Nothing Daunted, The Education of Two Society Girls in the West, and The Agitators, which she's talking about today. Three friends who fought for abolition and women's rights. She's been the executive editor of The New Yorker since January of 1996. She also writes for the magazine and is the moderator of its weekly podcast, Politics and More. A former Nieman Fellow at Harvard and later at McDowell, she was National Affairs editor at Newsweek from 93 to 95. And before that, she was the longtime executive editor at the New Republic. I have to throw in a little bit about her connection here at William Smith. She graduated magna cum laude, a member of Phi Beta Kappa with a BA in English with high honors. She served as a member of the college's Board of Trustees from 94 to 98. And in 1999, I was honored to present her with the inaugural recipient of the William Smith Alumna Achievement Award. In 2014, she received an honorary doctorate from Hobart and William Smith. And the last time I actually saw you, Dorothy, in person was exactly 2 years ago when you were here as the speaker at commencement 2019. And as I said, tomorrow, due to the COVID time warp, we're celebrating the classes of 2020 commencement. So I'm delighted to be here. I define a great book as one that provokes me to add other books to my reading list and to do some sleuthing on my own or inspires me to visit certain places. And in the midst of reading this book, I found myself doing a drive to Auburn, which is about a half hour for anybody who hasn't been here lately. From here to see the houses and the streets and the cemeteries referenced in the book. There's so much there. But for anyone who hasn't done that, I encourage you next time we have a live reunion to perhaps add in a part of a day to take a trip over to Auburn after you've read the book. So let's get to it. And I want to start with the really basic question of why these three women? How did you come to write about these three in particular?
Well, first of all, thank you, Kathy and Teresa, for arranging all this. I'm so happy to be here. I wish I were there in person, but in my mind's eye, I can see the quad and the lake. It's quite easy to visualize. So, and I wish I could see all of you too in the audience. So interestingly, this book began when I was doing research on my previous book, which Kathy mentioned, and I had never been to Auburn, New York, as many people from the East Coast never have. They don't know Central New York State at all, but my grandmother had grown up there, and that was a book about my grandmother. And she had told me that her grandparents, the Woodruffs, lived next door to the famous 19th century statesman, William H. Seward, and his wife, Frances. So I felt I had to go to Auburn to check that out. And it was also a book about her best friend, whom she had grown up with in Auburn. And that girl, Rosamond, lived across the street from the Sewards. And so I talked to a number of their descendants too. But while I was there, I checked out the fact that it was true about the Woodruffs. And then the young education director, who's no longer there at the museum, but she took me in hand and she wanted to give me a private tour of the house, which I was delighted to do. So the first thing she did was take me down a very dark, narrow set of stairs into the original basement kitchen of the house, which is where she told me Francis Seward secretly hid fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad. And that is a picture of the basement kitchen as it looks today. And that's what I saw that day. And I had never heard that story before. And I really wanted to hear more, even though I was real deeply immersed in my previous book. This woman, Jennifer Haynes, probably in her early 30s, she didn't want to talk about William Seward. She wanted to talk about Francis, whom she felt had been unfairly overlooked. So I wanted to know more. And she began talking about her best friend who lived around the corner, whose name was Martha Coffinwright. And Martha was a total pistol. From birth, she was a rebel. She was a Quaker. Her mother, who had brought her up long after her father had died in her youth, was a complete egalitarian and feminist, believed women were equal to men in just about every respect. And she was very strongly anti-slavery. And that was what Martha grew up to believe. And she also was deeply influenced by her elder sister, Lucretia Mott, whom some of you probably have heard of. Martha ran under the radar a little bit, but but Lucretia Mott, there she is, was a very famous, infamous in many circles, Quaker minister and advocate for human rights. She was one of the early advocates for human rights. So she began telling me a little bit about Martha, and I thought that she sounded really interesting. I sort of thought, well, why don't I know more about her, especially given her affiliation with Lucretia Mott, who was 14 years older and basically brought her up. And then Jennifer told me, moreover, these two women were extremely close friends with Harriet Tubman. And I just thought, that's absolutely incredible. So I wondered, how did Harriet Tubman, who grew up enslaved on the Eastern Shore, end up in Auburn, New York? It just seemed worth exploring. And I assumed that many others had made this connection, scholars and so on, but nevertheless, I wanted to know more. My grandmother had told me, and this came to mind as I was hearing this story about Tubman, my grandmother grew up in the 1880s with her friend Rosamond. And when she and Roz were standing on South Street one day, according to family lore, Harriet Tubman, who was an elderly woman by then, rode by on her bicycle. And I just thought, this isn't 6 degrees of separation. This is like 2. And then I later, when I began to explore the lives of all these 3 women, when I was finished with my first book, I met Harriet Tubman's, one of her great-great-grandnieces, both of whom still live in Auburn. And one of them, Judy Bryant, said to me, I don't think it was a bicycle. It was probably a horse-drawn cart. Harriet Tubman, after the Civil War, was a farmer. She farmed land, I learned, that had been sold to her by the Sewards. The land and the house were right down the street. This is, helping to integrate the town. So all of that seemed like the basis of a really interesting story. And when I finished my other book and started to investigate each of the lives of these women, I decided there is a book to be done here because it hasn't been done.
Awesome. Is your grandmother's house still standing?
No, unfortunately, it was long ago destroyed, but there is a visitor center there now, and which has been recently erected. I haven't even seen it. I went back in the last couple of years because I was finishing the book. So it's kind of a tourist center and so on. And this is part of Auburn kind of sort of coming back into its own, along with Harriet Tubman, the Harriet Tubman home, which she created in the final years of her life, and that has now been taken over by the National Park Service and is a companion site to the Underground Railroad, the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad site in Cambridge, Maryland.
Yeah. So one of the things that struck me was that you pulled so much from letters, and having read old English before, it's difficult to read the writing. It's hard to draw from old writing and letters. So could you talk a little bit about that whole process?
Yeah, well, one of the first, it is hard, and the handwriting, luckily, Martha in particular had extraordinarily beautiful penmanship. She was quite proud of it. But, in those days, people, wrote, to economize, they wrote, very cramped, and then they wrote up the sides of the letter and across the top on very thin paper, and so you could see both sides. So that was a bit of a chore, but I was working full time, so I hired Jennifer Haynes, who had already begun transcribing Frances's letters. I hired her to help me finish transcribing them. I did go to when I was still trying to figure out if I wanted to write this book and if there was enough to say. The Seward letters are housed at the University of Rochester, one of their libraries. And so I started by calling a curator there, and I said, do any of Frances Seward's letters still exist? And she said, oh yes, they're all here. But when they were originally donated to the library in the 1950s, I think it was, they were set aside as worthless. And that alone just kind of got my back up. And I went, and Jennifer told me the letters were extraordinary. So I went over and I started reading them, and indeed they were. And that led me to Martha's letters. One scholarly biography has been written about Martha Coffinwright called A Very Dangerous Woman, which we can talk about later if you want. And those letters are in the Sophia Smith collection at Smith College. And I was actually familiar with that collection because I used it. That's where my grandmother's letters are kept too. And I knew from that book was based on my grandmother's correspondence. She and Roz, who were deeply influenced by this earlier generation of Auburn women, were renegades. They went to Smith College, and they were, as very early graduates at an early women's college, and they were expected to settle down when they got home, get married, and start a family. And neither one of them was remotely interested in that. Instead, they heard about a one-room schoolhouse that had just been built on a very remote mountaintop in western Colorado, and they applied to be the first two school teachers. And to their amazement, they were. So they were hired. So the letters they wrote home to Auburn were the basis of that book, and they opened up that whole period of American history, and the opening of the West and all of the rest of that. So I knew that letters made the basis for good books. And luckily, my grandmother and Roz were great letter writers, and so were Frances and Martha. Martha, as my young friend Jennifer Haynes at the museum said, put the funny into feminism. She was caustic and angry at being confined to the house. She was the mother of 6. She spent all of her time cooking and cleaning and washing. It was just, she just hated every minute of it. So all of that was in the letters, and Frances wrote all about her frustrations. Her sister, Lizette, who lived around the corner, was being abused by her husband in the early, from 1829 to about 1833. And those were some of the first letters that I read that Frances wrote to her husband, Henry, as she called him. And divorce was really not an option in those days, because women had no rights to their own property, even if they had inherited money and property. And if they left their husbands, they had no right to their children. They had no custody rights at all. So those two repositories were just unbelievable. They opened up a whole world about race, politics, gender, marriage. There's a lot about the strains of marriage and the resentments of women at being kept in their place as they saw it, and they were. So that was great. And unfortunately, Tubman didn't leave behind any letters, so that provided a whole new set of challenges.
Yeah. So here's somebody who wasn't able to write, but is so probably more recognizable, or certainly more recognizable to all of us than the other two. So, in thinking about the gaps of what we actually really know about her, and how in getting the information from the letters of the other two, how do you tell a story that isn't in the person's doesn't include the person's own words, and
Yeah,
separating, myth from fact.
it was really hard. I have to say that was both the most challenging and probably the most rewarding part of writing the book. Harriet Tubman, and there's a lot of myth out there, as I quickly found in what has been written about her. She was just such a phenomenal character, but we all grew up knowing her as the great conductor of the Underground Railroad. And yes, she did that for 10 years. And she got to know Frances and Martha because they were both of them were harboring fugitive slaves in their basement kitchens. And Harriet Tubman, and this is known to scholars, in 1849, she was 27, I believe. She walked out of slavery on the eastern shore of Maryland. It was to Philadelphia, which she had heard was a free city, and there was room to get jobs and bring up your children in freedom, and there were schools for Black children. So she decided that would be her destination. It was a distance of almost 100 miles. She walked the entire way all alone. She left behind her parents and all of her siblings, and even her free husband, and who refused to go with her. He did not have her spirit of adventure or her courage, and he had steady work, and he knew that he would be in extraordinary danger if they were caught, as they were very likely to be, and he might be killed or torn apart by bloodhounds. He said, absolutely not. This is just ridiculous. And so he stayed. She went on her own. And one of the first people she met in Philadelphia was Lucretia Mott. But she got to know all of those abolitionists, and she began to plan this series of Underground Railroad extractions. There were a dozen of them over the course of a decade, and they eventually took her really right across central New York State. And if you look at a map of the state, Geneva and Auburn and Rochester and Syracuse are all basically along that band. And they were this Auburn clearly would be a great stopping point for Harriet Tubman, and Lucretia Mott clearly saw that, and Lucretia introduced her to Martha when Martha made one of her family visits to Philadelphia. And then clearly when Harriet Tubman came to Auburn to learn some more about where her roots would take her, Martha introduced her to Frances. So that was the beginning of this lifelong friendship among the three of them. So just quickly to finish answering your question, I will say that there's been some excellent scholarship in recent years. Kate Larson, there are a number of biographies, not just the children's biographies that we all grew up with, but Kate Larson has spent about 20 years of her life researching. She's got her PhD. Her book started out as a thesis, and she went on to publish the book. And the book is excellent. And I got to know her very well. She was incredibly generous with her time and information. And we met in Cambridge, Maryland, which was near where Harriet Tubman was born. And she took me all around that region. So I got to know that area. And then I also just pieced together her story. And I really wanted her to be a full-blooded character, just like the other two women, with her faults as well as her almost unbelievable strengths. So I began to piece together contemporaneous accounts. She quickly, as she began these Underground Railroad adventures, she got to know not only all the abolitionists in Philadelphia and across New York State, but also in Boston, which, as we know, was a real hotbed of activism. And then eventually she spoke in public. And so all of her friends, except for Frances, who was incredibly discreet, wrote down their accounts of what Harriet Tubman told them. And so it was a great way Tubman told the same stories over and over again about how she'd been brutalized as an enslaved girl, She told the story, the hair-raising stories about her Underground Railroad work. And eventually she talked about, and again, this is something I didn't know before I started writing the book, about how she decided in 1862 that she wanted to join the Union Army. And this was at a time when she decided that in 1862, Port Royal, South Carolina, was occupied by the Union Army. And there were 10,000 people enslaved people who had just been liberated by the Union Army, and they needed a lot of volunteers to come down and help them adjust to their new lives. So Harriet Tubman decided she would like to do some of that volunteer work, but she also would like to help the Union officers do sort of scouting and spying, because they were surrounded on three sides by the rebels. And so she gets an audience with the abolitionist governor of Massachusetts, who knew her by reputation, and he gave her permission, written permission, to go behind the military lines. And she got down to South Carolina. She got to know all of these generals and other officers, made herself completely invaluable to them. They gave her money to hire a little band of scouts, some of the local people who really knew the territory. And then she was a spy, but she knew before she left that this was what she was going to do. And everything she set out to do, she did it. So she told Martha, as Martha wrote in a letter to one of her children, well, Harriet Tubman says she's going to South Carolina to perform some kind of secret service. And that's exactly what she did. It's just amazing. And then she took part in a famous river raid along the abolitionist generals, along with the newly minted African-American soldiers from the region. They were newly trained. She was on the lead gunboat going up the Combahee River, and they stopped at 3 or 4 plantations, burned the plantations, and freed the enslaved people. And Harriet Tubman provided an incredible account of what this was like to see. It was at dawn when they stopped at the wharf of one of these plantations, and the steamer blew its whistle. And that was the signal for everyone to drop their work and run to the boats, because, as Harriet said, Uncle Sam has come to set us free. They all knew this. And so she describes this scene, what it was like, and it's incredibly vivid. She told that story to her biographer, Sarah Bradford, who wrote the first biography of Harriet Tubman after the war, about 1868, and Harriet and Sarah Bradford happened to be a resident of Geneva, New York, and her brother lived in Auburn, and so she made frequent trips there and got to know Harriet Tubman after the war when Harriet settled in Auburn. I think that may answer your question. But.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about that friendship of those 3 women and crossing race and class lines, and just a fascinating friendship, I think.
It is. And at first, when I first was confronted with this, I thought, well, this was quite, it was quite extraordinary. So Frances Seward was an aristocrat, and she had been born and bred to be the husband of a highly placed citizen, which she was, and to be the kind of well-read, well-behaved woman of her era, and never knowing that she would be brought up in the mid-19th century, that she would come to adulthood in the mid-19th century and become a revolutionary. So as I researched this, I thought, well, it's not quite as extraordinary as it seems on first glance, because Frances Seward was deeply religious. She was an Episcopalian. Harriet Tubman was a Methodist. Tubman couldn't read or write, but she had memorized long passages of the Bible. Frances read the Bible herself. So they had that in common. And Frances, by the time she met Harriet Tubman in the early 1840s, had become a radical women's rights advocate, in large part because she had witnessed her sister being beaten up by her husband, and she had become an abolitionist because she was already predisposed toward abolition, but she had taken a trip with her husband in 1835 to Virginia, just a leisurely trip south. But along the way in Virginia, which was the largest slaveholding state, they were confronted with two scenes of enslaved people being badly abused, and she never got over it. And by the time they returned home, she was a full-fledged abolitionist. Seward was anti-slavery, and very much so in public, but he did not advocate, as Francis did, immediate abolition. That was the truly kind of revolutionary idea. And from then on, their marriage had quite a number of tensions over this issue, because Francis thought he was, as a very influential statesman, he was not going quickly enough to liberate the enslaved people of America.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting little tension there that came out in the book. What about the abolitionist and sort of the intersection of the abolitionist and women's rights movements?
Yes. So then again, I learned all this, by the way, as I was doing. I didn't know all of this when I started, and then I got completely fascinated. So, for instance, Martha Coffinwright, as I said, would go to Philadelphia regularly mostly to visit Lucretia, but her other siblings and her mother lived there too. And in 1833, she went for one of her annual visits, and it happened to be the first meeting of William Lloyd Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society. And Lucretia and the other women in the family wanted to go. Martha wanted to finish a letter to her husband, so she too wasn't a flaming radical at that point. But Lucretia had been working for many years at that point, side by side with male abolitionists on the anti-slavery cause, and she knew William Lloyd Garrison, and she believed equally. She believed in human rights, as I said, and so she believed women should be treated as men's equal, and she believed that abolition had to come about, right away. So, but at that first meeting, women were not permitted to join. So even those, open-minded men, many of them did not think that was a good idea. So Lucretia went back to her cabal in Philadelphia of Black and white women, and they started the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, which was a companion, in effect, to the male abolitionist societies. And other female societies were started, and most of them, integrated by race, were started. And so that was the beginning of women sort of finding their voices, and they learned a lot from the abolitionist movement. They just came along a little bit later. And so the women's rights movement, many women, not many, a few women like Lucretia Mott were active behind the scenes, but it wasn't really until 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention down the road from Geneva, which was organized by Lucretia Mott, Martha Coffinwright, and three friends of theirs, that an actual organized movement began. And so Martha went, as the other women did. Obviously, she was expected to be a speaker, and that's a whole other story. She wouldn't speak in public at the time. She was 6 months pregnant with her 7th child at age 41, and she was also a grandmother. And she, at the time of Seneca Falls, she didn't think there was any other life for her. She couldn't imagine what it might be. But she met two key people there. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was a little bit younger than she was, who was a total firebrand, more even than Lucretia Mott. There she is with her 2 young sons at the time. That was taken in 1848. And Frederick Douglass, whom Martha had admired from afar. She had read his autobiography. He was only 10 years out of slavery himself. She just admired him. She thought he was one of the most kind of stellar examples of abolition abolitionist thinking in the country. And at the convention, Lucretia read aloud because Martha wouldn't speak. So Lucretia got back at her basically by reading aloud an essay that Martha had written, an excoriating essay about husbands and how they treated their wives and how they expected their wives to always be at their beck and call. It was hilarious and very mean, a real satire. And Lucretia read it aloud at the convention, and Lucretia appreciated Martha's gift for writing and satire. Martha didn't really think much of it. She didn't believe that her, what use was her writing? She wrote letters to Lucretia. That was it. And she wrote this essay. So to her amazement, after this essay was read aloud, Frederick Douglass came up to her and he said, I'd like to republish your essay in my newspaper, the North Star, which he had just founded in nearby Rochester. She was completely floored and of course thrilled. And so she took the occasion of Seneca Falls to become close to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who pulled her into women's rights and made her basically her deputy. Susan B. Anthony came along a little later. And then Frederick Douglass encouraged her interest in abolition. And Martha believed very much in setting an example for her very conservative neighbors in Auburn. Really, Frances was the only outlier, as she was. Most of them were really very conservative merchants and lawyers and farmers. And so whenever Frederick Douglass gave lectures across the state, and whenever he came to near Auburn, she invited him to have dinner or spend the night. And this was absolutely, appalling to her neighbors because she believed in social equality. And her thought was, well, the only way to change people's minds is to enact your beliefs. And I don't care what they think, I'm going to do this. And that was what led people to call her a very dangerous woman.
Mm. Wow. So out of curiosity, in any of the letters, is there any reference to either Elizabeth or anybody in the Blackwell family? Because I think that the family was also involved with the Philadelphia abolitionist movement.
There's one reference in one of Martha's letters about after Elizabeth Blackwell graduated from Geneva Medical College, which is now Hobart and William Smith, and said, look at this. I just read that Elizabeth Blackwell graduated and she'll be the first certified doctor in the United States. And then she was invoked. Elizabeth Blackwell was invoked often, but when the women, including Martha, eventually it was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and then Martha as kind of she was the kind of calming influence because those two were bomb throwers all the way. But Susan B. Anthony in particular, in her lectures would often mention the example of Elizabeth Blackwell and how incredibly important it was in helping to open up colleges in particular to women. That was one of their many goals. And so it was a big deal, across New York State, and the women's rights movement kind of adopted Elizabeth Blackwell as one of their own. Blackwell herself didn't want to have anything to do with the movement. And Janice Nomura, I don't know if any of you have read her very good book about I think it's called The Doctor's Blackwell. She gets into that and explains Blackwell's complicated ideas about feminism, and they were not all that enlightened in my view, but nevertheless, she was an incredibly important example in America and worldwide.
Yeah, I found that really interesting. Probably the first time I'd ever gotten a sense that she wasn't a champion of the women's rights movement when I read Janice's book. Kind of shocking. So here, having grown up in central New York and Syracuse, in the book you talk, and I recognize all of these places, but you talk about how this area, central New York, was truly a hotbed of these two movements. And I'm interested in why you think that was the case.
Yeah, and it was such an interesting mix and I had noticed this when I wrote my earlier book, Auburn in particular, was this very odd to me mix of real conservatism and then these little pockets of radicalism. And that was true across central New York State. But what happened was in the 1820s, 1830s, the Second Great Awakening, which was kind of the revivalist camp meetings led by Charles Finney, but others as well, they started holding these camp meetings across the central and western New York State in particular. And their teachings really caught on among people who were beginning to object to the real hierarchical and retrograde views of their established churches. And what Finney was preaching, and that part of New York State came to be known as the burned over district, because people were so fired up by the ideas that Finney was preaching, and he convinced them to break away from their churches and start other denominations like the Wesleyans. And there were many Quakers in that part of New York State. But in addition, many of these people were converted because Finney preached, unlike their established churches, that people had free will and that slavery was a sin. And it was up to the conscience of every individual to help overturn slavery. At these camp meetings also, women were allowed to speak, just as men were allowed to speak. And that was just complete, didn't happen anywhere, including, as I said, in the early years of the American Anti-Slavery Society. So that was, except in Quaker meetings, women did not speak in public, and except at the Seneca Falls Convention and subsequent conventions, they didn't speak in public. And that was why Martha Coffinwright was so terrified by the thought of it, because she had been inculcated with that idea as she was growing up. So all of that had happened. All those seeds were planted. And so by the time the 1850s came around, there were established stops on the Underground Railroad, and there were organizations in many cities to help. So the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, which enabled slaveholders to come into the free North and take back the people who they said were runaways. And these people had made lives, they had families, and they were established in their professions across New York State. So there were little groups in all of these cities, including Auburn, and probably in Geneva, that whenever a fugitive slave was taken, arrested, they would ring all the church bells, and all of the anti-slavery people would come together and try to seize back the arrested person. And they were very successful in a number of these operations. Harriet Tubman took part in one of the most extraordinary ones in Troy, New York. There was another one in Syracuse. So this involved people who never really had thought about slavery before, but who were appalled by the idea that the rights of their people were being trampled upon by Southerners whose laws they didn't respect. I've lost my audio. There we go.
The band was loud. I silenced myself.
It adds a little atmosphere.
Right. If anybody has a question, put it in the chat. But so because we're coming up on time here, but if you could ask each one of these women one question, what would it be? And not necessarily the same question, doesn't have to be.
Oh my gosh, that's a curveball. Nobody's seen that before. I guess I would ask, I would love to know what Frances Seward had to say about her marriage. On the other hand, I think I probably know the answer. She was so discreet. She never criticized him in public, but she sure did in private. But it would be interesting to talk to her about marriage and about her sister's abuse, and about how she awakened both to women's rights and to abolition. And then Harriet Tubman, I mean, I could spend hours and hours talking to her. And I guess I would ask her, you know, what she hoped her legacy would be. And there again, I think I sort of know the answer, but I would love to hear it from her own. I'd love to hear her talk about that. And then Martha, I guess it would be interesting to hear her view, her version of how she felt she was able in the end, because she had a lot of resistance at first to breaking out of those constraints she hated so much. And not only joining the women's rights movement, but becoming a regular speaker. She was the president. You know, they changed the presidency every year. And so often it was her turn. And she, to the end of her life, she hated it, but she did it anyway. And I know what her legacy is. She left behind, she taught her children and grandchildren that it was their duty to continue these reforms. And many of them did.
Good answers. They're good questions. So looking at the chat here, there's a message from Peter Edelman just saying that he has read both of your books and he has the signed copy of your first book, and that you were classmates.
Yes, hi Peter. I can't see you, but I'm glad you're there.
And he was. No, you were at his 22nd birthday party on Washington Street here.
Oh, good. Now I can see you guys.
Yeah. Someone is asking about a tour of Auburn and Seneca Falls with you, perhaps for the next reunion.
Maybe. We shall see what the year begins, what the year brings.
Yeah, that would be fabulous.
And I would like to say, and I hope she is on this call, Mary Gerhardt, who many of you remember, and I have been in constant contact with. I think that my interest in Seneca Falls started with her. She took me when I was a student at Hobart and William Smith to the Seneca Falls Visitor Center and gave me a little tour. And that it was probably 1977. And that was, these things take a long time to kind of penetrate. And that was one of the things that made a big impression on me.
And then Isabel Abelson, she just wanted to point out that you share an amazing faculty advisor, Katie Cook.
Oh, Katie. Well, this enables me. I just have to tell a very quick story about Katie. I was back in Geneva to see them, and Mary Gerhardt was having a small party on the beautiful back terrace of her home, which is now what, Kathy?
It's actually right now it's very lucky student housing.
Oh boy, well, they didn't have that one. I was there. Anyway, beautiful house, beautiful terraced Italian gardens, and Katie was there. And I had recently gone to work at the New Yorker, and I was really proud of that. I thought that was like the culmination of anyone's literary career. And Katie, who, those of you who remember, you did not spare anyone in her opinion with her opinions. And she looked at me and she said, "Why are you wasting your time doing that when you could be writing?" So truthfully, that probably stayed with me too. And I thought, oh, I better get cracking. Better go start writing some books.
Yeah, well, she was quite something.
She really was. And she was very inspiring. She was one of my favorites.
But I noticed something way after the fact, that she was wonderful to all her advisees, but she picked out those that she felt were worthy or had potential and gave them that little extra oomph, that little dig, that you could be doing this or you could be doing that. And it was different for everybody.
Yes.
She told you that you could be writing, and she told me something else. And she was an amazing woman.
Yeah, and a lot of students refused to take her classes because she was so terrifying.
Yeah, I could say that if there was one person who had the most profound effect on me as a person, it was Katie.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. She was really something.
Well, it's nice to sort of meet you face to face.
Me too.
Every time we lived not too far from Katie at the end of her, before she went down to Florida after she had her stroke. And I heard all about you,
Oh,
all about Dorothy Wickenden.
very
Oh.
proud,
Yeah, she was. She was.
very proud. Any other questions? Probably have time for one more if anybody has a question or comment.
I have one.
Go for
You
it.
hear me? It's Lori Rayner, class of 80. And I want to say that all my schooling there, etc., just made it clear. My first, and I did intern at the Geneva Historical Society, but my first job was with the Seneca Falls Historical Society with Ann Herman as our director, class of 75. And we were the grant writers, the people who brought all the scholars, everybody to Seneca Falls, and ultimately made it a national park. And I'm so pleased to see Seneca Falls, the Anthony House, the Tubman House, all being open, because when I was toiling away in central New York, we couldn't go in these resources. But I like to say I'm very proud to have made it happen in Seneca Falls.
Well, congratulations and thank you for that. A really important work.
Yeah, thank you. Well, with that, thank you, Dorothy. And I put in the chat, but I'll say it. Dorothy Wickenden with no dots or dashes.com. And there's all sorts of wonderful information there. And if you don't have the book, you can order it in a variety of places. The College Store has it. So I encourage you to get a copy. And I think we're going to have to plan that tour.
I'll be there.
I'm open.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a great
Thank
weekend.
you.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.